All right, take a look now. Turn, if you will, to in the scriptures to Philippians chapter 4. We're coming to the kind of the close of the book of Philippians. And again, as I've told you before, the book of Philippians, it was written to a group of Christians at Philippi. I've already talked to you about all this. Just recap just a little bit. This was a different group. There weren't as many Jewish people living here. So it was a predominantly Gentile, that is non-Jewish group in Philippi. And they were, the town's history and tradition was, it became it was a huge battle happened there. So there were a lot of retired military, a lot of officers, a lot of just regular soldiers that retired there. And of course, that'd been a few years, a few decades since that big battle happened there. But it became a very wealthy area. But it also became it was a Roman colony, so it had a lot of privileges. They had all the privileges in Philippi that you had if you lived in Rome. No taxes, things like that. So we've already talked about all those things, but there was a great church that God started there. God used Paul to start a great church, and it was growing and it was doing a lot of good things, neat things. But isn't everything, all right? There were struggles. There weren't as many at Philippi, but there was one. Today's title is Stability. Stability. And it is one of those things, again, I just want to share just straightforward with you, because there's a part of the context here that if you can learn, there's part of what we're going to talk about today, there's some real quotable verses, all right? Probably verses you've heard before. If you haven't, you'll hear them for the first time. It'll be great. But most of you probably, or a lot of you have heard these. But if you don't understand the context, it really changes what it's being said, right? Now, let me talk about this word stability. One of the great fights that you have in being a church, one of the great struggles that I have is instability, right? The tendency for a church to destabilize. And that just is a natural thing that you constantly fight against. Struggles, differences of opinions. It's a miracle this place even exists. I mean, without God at work in us, it couldn't exist over time. It just wouldn't work because of everything that goes on. But to destabilize or to cause instability is what Paul's talking about in the first part of this chapter. All right? And his fight, if you take a look at everything Paul wrote, all right, all of the different letters he wrote to all the different churches, this was a main topic. And the topic is firmness, a stable footing, all right? Keeping it strong, right? Because whenever it destabilizes, and then rumors, and then innuendos, and then griping and complaining, and then differences of this opinion, that opinion, and then all of a sudden you're in disarray, and the church just can't be effective. But it is a constant battle, all right, to be stabilized. Why? Because the church has three enemies, okay? And the Bible's real clear about those. It may have more, but it has at least these three. And believe it or not, one of the enemies is us, right? You'll see it in just a minute. All right. Number one, the first enemy is the world, right? The world around us. The world around us has tons of opinions. It's incredible to watch the fads and all of the different things come and go. Now that I'm getting a little bit older and I've seen several decades go by, I start to see our world changes with the wind, and it's amazing how people talk the lingo, and now we're kind of in a politically correct era, you know, where we all have these, and we get so much from the opinions and what the world around us thinks we ought to be, right? And then what the world around us thinks, the temptations and everything that goes with it, all right? You know, it says in 1 John, just so you hear, this is interesting. 1 John chapter 2, verse 15, it says, don't love the world, okay, or the things that are in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So we know that are believers, right? We know the believers in understanding those that are his, right? There will be something inside of you that drives you to not let the world be an influence on you. And yet it constantly does, right? It's a constant battle. You're gonna battle it, right? To say that you don't battle it anymore leaves you vulnerable. It just does, because you're always gonna struggle with this, right? But sometimes it may not have as big a struggle, but denying that you do have a struggle makes you vulnerable. It just is the way it works. So there's constant temptations, constant everything. If you're his, if there is no battle, you may not be his. So we're definitely talking to people today that are his, right? So one of the first great enemies I can't tell you how many opinions people have out in the world of what they think, who they think we are, and what they think we ought to be doing, what they think we ought to be doing. And in reality, listen to me, I don't really care what their opinions are. I mean, seriously, I've grown far enough, I really don't care. Let's be who he's called us to be. And I've just learned through history, that's never gonna be popular with the world around us. But you and I are not in that game, right? We're not playing that scoreboard. We're a different scoreboard, we're a different game, we're a different whatever you wanna call it. That's why you can't go that direction, or you're never gonna be who he's called you to be. So number one enemy is that. Number two is ourselves, right? Sinful nature that lives in us. All right, the flesh is what the Bible calls it. The world, the flesh, number two. And so when you think of the flesh, you think about the sinful nature that lives in us. And it does live in all of us, right? And again, you live in a world that doesn't believe that anymore. In fact, you live in a world to where they don't even think sin exists anymore, right? It's crazy. I mean, is that it's all a mistake and all whatever, but the scriptures are real clear about the sinful nature that lives in us. In fact, Paul even talked about when he became a believer. This is in Romans chapter 6, 7, and 8. He talks about the two natures that live in him. The old nature, right? The sinful nature that's prone towards different things, It's kind of like teaching your children. You don't have to teach them to be selfish, right? How do you teach your children to be selfish? Don't do anything. Seriously, if you want to teach them to be selfish, you really don't have to do anything. But if you want to teach them to be unselfish, then you're going to have to work at it. Why? Because we all have natural bents, right? It's just the way it works. Anyway, so this battle in here, right? That's what the scripture says, right? In fact, in Matthew 26, it says this: watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. He said the spirit, that is that part of you that's his, right, is willing, but the flesh is weak. So there's a battle. There's a battle with yourself. And the church struggles. We're going to struggle with that. Why? Because of our individual fights that sometimes we win, sometimes we don't win, It's a battle, right? It's a battle, right? So that's another enemy. Okay, number three is what the scripture says is Satan himself, the devil, all right? The enemy, whatever you want to call it. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8 says, be sober-minded, be watchful, your adversary, the devil prowls. There we go. Devil prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking who he could devour. We also live in a world, right, that doesn't believe in an enemy like this, just like they don't believe there's even a God. And the problem comes, right, with everything else, but I'm not going there today. But this is an amazing thought, We also live in an era where a lot gets blamed, right? Well, the devil made me do it, that kind of thing. But he doesn't, right? He gets far too much credit. He has two big weapons, right? Fear and doubt. Fear and doubt, as a look through scripture, right? And so when you understand that, because it's like when we don't want to take responsibility really for anything, we go, well, it wasn't me, it's like, come on. Personal responsibility for what that means. So it's an understanding that the church, the enemies of the church really come in all different sizes and shapes. But what it really tells us, and let me finish this. Whenever I use the C word, I feel like I have to explain it. The C word, church, all right? What is the church? The church is groups of believers The church is not a denomination, right? It's not some bureaucratic thing, right? That it passes all the way down, and that those that are up here in the bureaucracy are passing judgments down here on the level where we all live, and they don't even know how it makes. That is not what the church are. Individual believers that Christ has changed your life, who band together to do what he's called us to do and to be who he's called us to be. So when I say the C word, this is what I'm talking about. What does it mean to destabilize, right, a church? Because when we have stability, that makes the difference. You'll see it. Now, let's talk through this. Because this is what was happening in Philippi. If you want to understand the context of chapter 4 and Philippi, really, if you want to understand a lot of it, understand these next few verses, right? Now, if you want to take down some notes, they're very easy. Number one is to unify, right? Unify. Therefore, my brothers, it says in verse 1, Philippians chapter 4, verse 1, therefore, my brothers, whom I love and I long for, my joy and my crown, right? Now, the word crown right here, the word crown is the Greek word Stephanos, all right? So if your name is Stephen, all right? Steve, Stephanie, this is what your name means, all right? It means crown. Now, it's not a king or queen's crown. It's a victor's crown. Like a laurel wreath, that they crowned the winner of a race or winner of some event. So what is Paul? Again, I always love for you to understand things as they appear and as they really are. So what is Paul really saying to these Philippians? All right, you're my joy, but he says, also you're a win for me. All right, that's pretty cool when you think about it. So in reality, you're a win. What God is doing in your life, I call that a win for me, right? That is cool. Again, it's kind of where we're going, but that, I just love pointing things out and okay, that's cool when you see what does that really mean, right? Right. So he goes on to say, stand firm, right, in the Lord, my beloved. Stand firm. We talked a little bit about it last week, but I wanted to reiterate today. The word stand firm means, it's a military term. It can be used for other things, but it is used often in military. If you were part of the military, especially infantry, hold your position is the thought here, right? Hold your position. Don't retreat. Solid footing. Don't let fear and doubt overcome you. Stand fast. Hold your position. This is what he's telling them, right? In other words, because it's starting to get a little scary, right? But if you want to mess up, you want to destabilize the church, you mess up its footing and its foundation. And then you got everybody questioning everything, and then you got the murmurers start being listened to, the rumors starts being listened to, and then it just destabilizes all the more, and it becomes totally ineffective, right? So what is he encouraging them here? He's encouraging them to hold your position. Why? Because something is rattling it. Something's causing anxiety, right? Jeff, where do you see that? You'll see in just a minute, all right? It's pretty, but just want you to see at the beginning. All right, verse 2. I entreat Euodia, right? And I entreat Syntyche, right? To agree in the Lord. Now, these, you'll find out in just a minute, these are two ladies in the church at Philippi. And they're highly respected. And they were having a sharp disagreement, right? And it was causing ripple effects, right? Divisiveness, not just divisiveness, but fear, right? Now, so before you judge these two harshly, let's read a little bit more about them. All right, look at verse 3. Yes, I ask you also, true companion. We're not really sure who he's talking about true companion here, because he doesn't tell us. But he's writing to somebody, and he says, help these women, right, who have labored by my side with me in the gospel. together with Clement. Now, we don't know much about Clement. Some try to equate him to the guy in Rome who was the early church leader, but there's very little that says that's the same. But anyway, so what is he saying? He's saying, first of all, these two ladies, they're not troublemakers, right? So we're not talking about those who are just within the church who are trying to cause problems. We're talking about strong believers. We're talking about, as Paul would consider, co-workers, friends, co-laborers, and who actually stood by his side in some really tough times. So we're not talking about troublemakers, right? And we're not talking about differences in doctrine, all right, teachings. That can really mess things up too, because if that was it, Paul would have addressed it. So what we're talking about is a real conflict issue. And it had gotten a root, and it was starting to cause problems. You want to know why we have so many denominations today? Because of this, right? And then it destabilizes, and so then they just split apart and become two different ones. That's just the way it has happened. It is not God's intent. The denominations were never God's intent, right? Or Christ's intent. Not at all, right? So what's he saying here? Well, obviously, Paul is kind of, I think, talking out of experience, because Paul himself had a tough division between him and Barnabas. If y'all remember the story in Acts, and they were on a missionary journey, right? And John Mark went with them, and then when they came back, but John Mark, got homesick or whatever happened to him, he left them in the middle of their journey. And the next time, they went on the second missionary journey, Barnabas wanted to take John Mark, but Paul didn't. And says there was a sharp division among them. And it was so harsh that it divided Paul and Barnabas. And they went different directions. So Paul is kind of like on the page here of, okay, guys, that can't happen again. We're not going to do that, right? All right, so again, we're not talking about, and the other thing about these ladies is that obviously they were leaders and they were prominent within the church. We just don't know what the problem was. But it was enough to where it began to destabilize, right? Because there was enough respect for both of them in the church to where people started having to choose sides. Okay, is it coming across now what we're dealing with here? And when you see it, it makes the rest of the verses, oh, that's why Paul would say that. That's why Paul would say that. So you have these two, and so Paul is basically saying, hey, listen, all right? Look back at verse 2. You need to help them, right? All right. First of all, verse 2 says, agree in the Lord, right? And look at verse 3. Yes, and also ask, true and pagan, help them. Somebody step forward, get them in a room, and make it work. All right? It's time for this to happen. So since this is not a teaching type issue, this is either a personality or a disagreement in leadership or whatever, right? When it all comes down to it, I have found most of the divisions and most of the conflict in reality over real simple stuff. I don't want to say this, but they're really minor. I call them dumb things. Right? Seriously. I mean, what I've been doing now, I've been doing it for a long time. Now, it's important to the person, but in the grand scheme of things of who Christ is, it's very insignificant. It's amazing what can be divisive. And so maybe it was that. But basically, Paul is saying, hey, listen, get some of the elders of the church, get in there and hammer this thing out and make it right. Come on, we're all part of the same family, the same Jesus, the same Spirit lives in all of us. There's got to be a way to do this. It's basically what he's saying to them. But the main thing I want you to see is that we're not talking about just troublemakers. We're not even talking about ungodly people. We're talking about two people who love the Lord with all their hearts. So this is not just one of those typical, Paul says, like he did to the Corinthians, okay, you just need to get rid of them. All right, seriously, they're doing nothing but causing problems, and there's no desire in their lives to follow who Christ is. You just need to get rid of them. I mean, read Corinthians. I mean, if you don't believe that, because that's what he said, all right? So there's your context. So everything that follows is about the anxiety and the struggle that's going on in the local congregation there at Philippi because two people of prominence are having a problem. And people are having to choose sides, and they know that's wrong. And so there's anxiety of what's going to happen, what's going to happen, what's going to happen. So the rest of this passage is in response to that. All right, so let's jump into it. All right, Number two is rejoice. Now this is a weird thing to say after you've just said that. But let's see what Paul said by this, all right? Take a look now, if you will, in chapter 4. It says, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I'm going to say it, rejoice. Okay, it's almost like you got whiplash. Paul, what are you talking about? Right? You just talked about this conflict, and you're saying that one of the ways to overcome it is to rejoice? Right? How do you do that one, right? Or what are you even talking about? Well, first of all, you have to understand, what does it mean to rejoice? The word rejoice is joy, rejoice. It's not an emotion, okay? Happiness is an emotion. Joy is a state of mind. Joy is reflecting and living in a state of obviously being in Him in this particular case. And so this joy has to do with understanding who you are in Him. But it's, when you talk about sometimes a believer loses his or her joy, what happens is usually is you get your eyes off of the main thing, off who Christ is, and you get it on other things. And then you begin to struggle, right? And you lose a little bit of joy, but you'll be amazed if you'll refocus back to the things that matter, back to who you are in Him, about the day you became His, a believer, forgiveness of sins for the past, you know, hey, you have a purpose now, be a part of it, your future's secure in Him, and you keep your eyes and your focus, right, where it needs to be, joy will be part of it. But when you lose it, and we all do that, right, is that you get the focus on the other things, and all of a sudden, you fall prey to stuff. So what he's saying is rejoice. Look at this, verse 5. It says here, let your reasonableness be known to everyone. All right, now, it is so hard to translate that word, reasonableness. Reasonableness is okay translation, but there's really no English word that explains what's being said there. So I'm just going to have to talk you through it. Some say gentleness. But that doesn't really get it either. The word actually means not so much tolerant, because I can't even say that word anymore because it means something totally different in the world you and I live in. But it means to not just patience, right? But it really means to bear with people, right? If somebody hurts your feelings, if somebody messes up, then don't cause divisiveness because your feelings are hurt. I know that sounds weird for all being a part of one word. Basically, it not only means to be long-suffering, but to be the bigger person here, right? Is to understand that the small things, let them go. Come on, right? Because I've usually found that some of the greatest struggles come over things that are real insignificant, especially in the local church. It's amazing how it works. You know, the color of the drapes. I mean, this is not here, right? I can't tell you, I was part of a church that, seriously, the color of the carpet. I mean, there was a 4-hour business meeting on a Wednesday night, right? As people started calling each other names. And I mean, that seems foreign to you. That's part of the reason I don't think I was ever a believer till I was 21, because I was never really exposed to what it means to follow Christ. You know, this thing, I mean, this huge brouhaha, divisiveness over usually something dumb, and this is what he's talking about. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. In other words, come on, guys, keep the main thing the main thing. You know, keep the main thing the main thing. You know, just sharing with you what I've learned through the years, and not just studying the scriptures, but also looking at the church down through history. And I tell you what, the church has screwed up as much as it's done good. I mean, that's obvious. And usually at the times it's screwed up is because it's gotten its eyes off of the main thing of who we're supposed to be, and letting things happen that and just weren't supposed to be. You know, and this sounds crazy, but as I've studied church history, when the church, and when I say the C word, I'm not talking about denominations. All right? When I say the C word, I'm not talking about Baptist, Catholic, Methodist. I'm talking about believers who band together to be who God's called them to be, irregardless of what some bureaucratic council says somewhere. All right? It's what the scripture teaches us. That's what I'm talking about. I have found that just studying church, when the church has been the strongest is when there's been the heaviest of persecutions. Isn't that weird? So then I ask myself, right? Why is the church the strongest during persecution, during hard times? Because it focuses people on things that really matter, right? You don't have time to argue if baptism is sprinkling or immersion. Because when you're wondering if the soldiers are going to show up at your door and arrest you, who's going to spend time arguing about that stuff? Or whether the pastor should wear a robe when he speaks. I mean, people get bent out of shape over all kinds of things. But during times of persecution, nobody cares. Wear a robe, don't wear one, whatever. Let's be who he's called us to be. We need to band together because we're not going to survive this persecution if we don't. That's why the church is always the strongest, because the main thing always stays the main thing, and people they have stability in their firm, even though there's persecution. Isn't that interesting? So when you think about what he's talking about, I mean, it's a powerful concept to get what he's saying here, right? Is that guys, and by the way, history tells us that this Philippian church got so strong that they wound up having one of the biggest impacts in this entire area because of this firm footing, right? Hold your position, Don't let anything mess that up. I don't know, it's an interesting thing. Right? So let your reasonableness known to everybody. Number 3, pray. This is interesting here. All right, take a look at verse 5 again. Let me get out of the way. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord's at hand. Okay? Now verse 6. Now this is one you maybe have heard before. It says, don't be anxious about anything. Now what is anxiety? I think we all know what that is. Anxiety, worry, usually we're anxious about the things we don't have any control over. That is that impending fear that something might happen. If you could have something, if you can control it, you're probably not anxious about it. So it's those things that are about to happen that you're fearful of what might happen. Okay? Am I on track there? Right? So what were the people anxious about? They were anxious that the church at Philippi was going to be crippled because of this division between these two. They were worried, well, what happens if this happens, they say to this one and this one, and the church is just going to be in disarray, destabilized, right? So, but what Paul's saying here, listen, don't worry about those things. Don't be anxious about anything, but in everything. So this goes beyond just this situation, it goes to all of us, right? Pray for them. But in everything, pray for them. But by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. To pray. Prayer is an amazing thing, all right? So if you want to know, if you're a worrier, if you're someone that struggles with anxiety, right? And it's probably all of us in the room at one time or another, but if you're struggling with it now, I want you to know the scriptural model is twofold: prayer and gratefulness. Being the thankful person, right? And you can really only do those things if you have a relationship with God already, right? It's like somebody came to me one time and said, who was struggling with worrying, Jeff, I prayed and it didn't work. And I'm like, okay, you didn't get it, did you? Bless your heart. You see, it's not just some magic thing that God zaps you with, Okay, she prayed. All right? Well, what is he talking about? Now, I'll get to both of these things, but prayer in its essence is trusting God, right? That's giving it to him. It is in its essence, it's an act of faith, right? As long as I think I can do something about it, or it's up to me, then you're going to be anxious. Why? Because there's really, how much control do you and I really have? If you're honest. We control the little areas, but in reality, the big areas, how much? Not much. And so you ought to be anxious, right? If you're sane, all right? And so trusting him is saying, Lord, there's not anything I can do about this one. I'm going to have to learn to trust you here. I'm going to have to trust you. I'm going to have to trust you. Right? Now, the other one is thanksgiving, gratefulness. So the perspective of being grateful, I just want to take a minute because I always read this verse at Thanksgiving time because of the word, obviously. But the giving of thanks, the word here is Eucharist, right? Which a lot of people give that to the Lord's Supper. This actual word, the Greek word, is Eucharist. So the cup part, some denominations during the Lord's Supper communion, it's called the Eucharist. All that means is thanksgiving, okay? That's all it means. So anyway, so Eucharist, all right, or Thanksgiving. Giving thanks is incredible of what it does for you. Let me tell you what I mean there. It's kind of like God doesn't need our thanks, but it's the difference it makes in our lives. That's why I tried to teach it to my children. A grateful spirit is someone who has more peace on the inside than someone who thinks they're always have the short stick. They're always complaining about their situation or what's happening. But if you're a believer today, then focus on who you are in him. Be grateful for forgiveness. Be grateful for the purpose you have in this present. Be grateful for your future that's secure. And live a life of being grateful, and you'll be amazed at how anxiety won't overcome you as much. So prayer with thanksgiving is the two. Guys, but it's a journey more than it is with being zapped with it. I always love to tell the story, right? I always love to tell the story of the disciples, right? They went out into the boat, and Jesus went into the bottom and went to sleep of the boat. There's a big fishing boat. And so they were going out into the water, and this huge storm came up. And most of them, or a good chunk of them, were fishermen. So they'd been on the water all their life, but they'd never seen a storm. And they freaked out. They freaked out. You're talking about instant anxiety. Why? Because they're in a perilous situation, which they had no control over. So they just freaked. They forgot that Jesus was in the boat. Right? They just freaked. Guys, we've all done that. Right? Maybe some of us are a little more susceptible than others, but we've all struggled in that area. Okay? If you have kids, you've struggled in that area many times. Right? But what happened? Right? Finally, when all else failed, they asked Jesus. And it was one of these, don't you care that we're all going to die? Okay, read the story. It's classic. And so we've all had those prayers. God, and so Jesus walks out on the boat and he calms, right? Peace be still was his words. And then, I just got a vivid imagination because, these 12 Jewish guys with these beards with water probably coming off of them look back and, and of course they said, what manner of man is this that even the weather obeys him, basically. So, when you've been through enough storms, you begin to trust Jesus first before you freak out. That's how you combat anxiety. You learn it. All right? For those of you who have ears to hear, this could be the best message you've heard in a long time. Those that struggle with the paralyzing grip of anxiety. Right? Learning to trust him, learning to follow him, that's who he's called us to be. Right? Anything you can do about these two in the church, all right? Pray for them, right? Be grateful in your own self, but you don't have to freak out. So don't be anxious for anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Verse 7, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding. In other words, it doesn't make sense. Will guard, the word for guard is to stand guard. It's the actual word for sentries to be posted to guard a post or go to guard something. Will guard your hearts and mind. The peace of God will guard your hearts and mind. So prayer, thanksgiving results in peace. It's just a powerful thought when you think on it, right? Of what they're talking about. This is who we're supposed to be, right? This is what he's called us to do, right? Especially when you enter these particular situations, right? All right, number 4, finally, is the word think. Now, I only got a few minutes to share this one with you. I may start here the next time because this is such an important passage. But I can't tell you how important this word think is. Because so much of who you are is what you fill your mind with and what you think about, right? And it's those things that turn into the actions, right? The old proverb, sow or plant a thought, and reap an action, right? It all begins with what you think, right? And that is one thing you can control, right? To a certain extent. What goes into your mind? By way of what you read, by way of what you hear, by way of what you do. All of those things, right? Watch, see, whatever. All those things go into your mind, right? Now, so look at verse 8. Finally, brothers, whatever is true. That's just the standard word for truth. When I looked it up, it's just the words, it's God's truth is basically what it is. I found it interesting too that we're living in a culture, really the only culture, one of the only cultures on earth, most all the cultures are different, but that doesn't even believe there's a God. And so, although believe it or not, it's really a small group in our country, but they just scream the loudest, all right? But almost invariably, those that don't believe in God don't believe in anything that there's anything such as absolute truth, which makes sense. If you don't believe there's a lawgiver, then why are you going to believe there's truth, right? If there's no truth giver, right? Anyway, so it says here, finally, brothers, whatsoever is true, whatever is honorable, that is respectable, that gains respect. This is all about who Christ is, right? Right? Whatever is just, is it? Just the question of is it right? Is it right? Right? Whatever is pure. The word pure is the word is the Greek word for holy. Really, what the word means. Holy. The word holy means pure. That means there's an absence of anything else. So when you have a bottle of pure iodine, then you remember there's nothing else in the bottle but iodine. Right? Therefore, pure means an absence of anything added to it. So when it said pure is a good translation. So the question is it pure, right? Whatever is lovely, does it pertain to love, right? Is it loving others? So on and so on, right? Whatever is commendable, right? Whatever, if there's any excellence, that is the definition between, the difference between good and best, right? Right? If there's anything worthy of praise, now listen, this is powerful. He says this, think on these things. So it all begins in your mind. Think on these things. So if you really want to know, this is part of the level of control that you do have. Not always, but do. You can control what goes into your brain, right? And it gives you a list of things. This criteria is try to set a guard, right? And not let some of the garbage get into your brain. You know, there's an old computer term that they don't use much anymore. GIGO, right? Garbage in, garbage out, right? If you're struggling with habits or things in your life, then you may want to stop the inflow. You know, when lots of years ago now, before I got to Florida, they were talking about cleaning up the Everglades, cleaning up the Everglades, cleaning up the Everglades. And so they brought all these people down and they figured out, okay, how we're going to clean up the Everglades. And they came up with a brilliant solution. Seriously, this is what they came up with. Stop polluting it. Okay, they probably got paid millions of dollars for that, and I could have told them, right? But that the Everglades would naturally clean itself if you just stop polluting it. So if you really want to make some difference in your life, stop the inflow of garbage in, and you'll be amazed what happens. That's why he's saying, think on these things, right? I was at a Bucks game or something, I don't remember, and I went into the restroom, and there was this guy, he was washing his hands at the sink, and I recognized him from not this church, all right, my other church, and I came up, you know, and pushed him, right? And if you're a guy, you know what I'm talking about. Hey, man, the girls don't, what, you mean pushing? You want to fight? No. It was just fun, kind of, hey, buddy, and this guy lets out a string of profanity, right? And it was before he saw who pushed him, right? And so, anyway, again, that's why I said previous church, don't try to figure out who it was, all right? And, you know, he turned around and looked at me. I said, hey, man, what's up? And I couldn't help but laughing, and oh, hey, pastor, you know, and guys, I'm not one who judges. I don't, you know, but I want to know why it's so bad to say that in front of me and not everybody else. Why do you feel so terrible in front of me, but you wouldn't have felt bad in front of anybody else? It's kind of hypocritical, right? And so if you are his, then clean it up. How do you clean it up? Stop polluting, right? And anyway, he felt so bad. And because we went back to the game and he scheduled an appointment to come by and see me. And he did, he felt bad. And that was fine. I'm just not a judgmental guy because I remember who I was before I became a believer. And give people room to grow, right? Don't shoot them and condemn them. Just don't do it, guys. It's not who God's called us to be. Right? So anyway, and so he was talking to me. He says, Jeff, it just slipped. But I did help him. No, it didn't slip. Right? You make a practice of that. That's why it just naturally came out. Right? So if you want to get that out of your life, this is not a message on profanity, by the way. This is a message on how do you get things out of your life that you don't want there. Right? If you want it there, then just keep doing what you're doing. But if you don't want it there, then start cleaning up the inflow, right? It's incredible how it works. Because the scripture says out of the abundance, Jesus himself said, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So what's down here comes out, right? Verse 9, what you have learned, right, and received and heard and seen in me, says practice these things. That word practice means repetitive. You have to work at it, right, over and over and over again. Golf, baseball, those are repetitive games. In other words, you get it, you do it 1,000 times until you get muscle memory to where it just happens. So in other words, Start putting the right things into your brain and then practice, 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 practice. Proverbs 23:7, for as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So it all begins with your thoughts. And especially the thoughts that you pour in. The things you choose to do, right, read, whatever. Guys, these things change who we are, right? That's why I love to have things and make choices of things, because it's putting the right things into my brain, right? That's why the world and the flesh, those things battle against those things, but those things shouldn't be, right? Unless you're a newer believer, right? But as you grow in him, right? Start filling yourself with, obviously, what we're doing today as far as teaching God's word, just verse by verse, or other things around people. By the way, isolated believers are vulnerable believers, right? He hadn't called us to be isolated. And guys, believe me, that's a tough one for me because I can have a tendency to be a loner, right? That's not who God's called me to be. He's called me to band together with a group of people. No one soldier wins a battle. A group do. So it's something he's called us to do. It's something he's called us to be. It's what makes this passage so powerful. Because it really gets down to the bottom level of how do you stand firm? How do you have a stable footing, right? How do you hold fast? How do you hold your position? How, when everything comes at you, right? How do you sit in the boat when the storms come up and you don't freak out? When you get to the point to where you understand who he is, and Lord, I can trust you. But that takes some journey and some time and putting into your mind the right things. God bless you this morning. If there's never been a time in your life you put your faith and trust in him, there'll always be people right here afterwards. While that hasn't been the message this morning, the message this morning has been about, right, what it means to be his and ridding ourselves of things in our life that we don't want there. But if you're not his, these things are impossible unless you are his. There'll be some people up here afterwards. Love to talk to you. All right, God bless you. We're going to sing a song as we close. And so let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll transition to that. God, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the time we've had this morning. And God, just the chance to look at your word and see what it teaches us. So God, bless this time. If anything good's happened today, God, it's because we know you. And Lord, we pray this in Jesus' name. All right? Amen. Amen.